Any of you, any of you are aspiring game makers? Anybody here game developers? One, two, three? Okay, awesome. I happen to know that Georgia is the next Helsinki in terms of game development. I truly believe this. I truly believe that you have all the ingredients here, and I want to talk to Tomo about what some of those are, particularly for those of you who are interested in developing games and creating your own IP. So we've been talking over the last couple of days about a few things in the creative process, right? And I thought we'd kind of kick this off by talking about your creative process as you're designing games. There's kind of two facets to this. There's your own personal creative process, and then there's how do you lead a creative team. Can you maybe tee that up for us a little bit?
For sure. So when we start talking about creativity, I think it's sort of too vague for people to kind of like pin their understanding on. We use the word creativity to cover things we don't understand. So let's try to get it a little more concrete. We are trying to create a description of an experience for another person, something they're actually going to go through, something that's going to make them pay attention, something that's going to make them remember, something that's going to make them happy or excited, right? And so how do we start the process of designing that thing? And so in the context of, wait, what was the question again? I just started running off.
No, and that's fine, because I think that's what we want to get is kind of a download on what your personal creative process is, but and then we can kind of bridge that into running creative teams.
So the leadership part of it is really important, right? You can't actually do much by yourself. You have to be able to communicate what it is we're going to do, where it is we're going to go, what it is we're going to try to accomplish. So ultimately, the problem does revolve around creativity. They have this saying, ideas are cheap and execution is what matters. And sometimes that makes us think that the ideas don't matter. The ideas matter, but the ideas themselves have a similar analogy, except that the idea in your head is literally nothing until you have the capability of communicating it effectively. And the problem is, communicating ideas effectively is a lifelong project. And so let's have a conversation about how we get that ball rolling faster.
Yeah. So you've led big game projects. Spider-Man, worked on Call of Duty, things that there are different kinds of game designers working on those, right? There's system designers, there's narrative designers, there's people writing dialogue. What for somebody who's maybe interested in getting into the games industry, what are the different types of game designers that you work with and that you've led in the past?
Yeah, this is kind of a funny question. Well, I think it's worth noting, starting off with this idea that the industry doesn't entirely understand what a designer is or what a designer does. Because the word designer is what we used at first, and even at the beginning, there were people doing lots of different things in the context of design. What I'd like to describe is what a designer does, like maybe some important atomic piece of it, is that they are trying to learn, they have a practice that leads to them knowing what a change to the experience will do to the user. Now that sentence won't mean much to you now, but hopefully as we talk about it, we can start filling in how you get there. And how you get there is this process of like theorizing what is a good experience, then describing a way to build it, then building it, then testing it, and then comparing the results of that test to what it is you wanted. It sounds very simple when you say it, but it becomes really easy to lose sight of what it is you wanted out of that experience to begin with, and that's the creative part. And to kind of tie that to like something specific, it's what actually happens to the player. I feel like a lot of us when we're young, we're designing games, and we're trying to build the design, and we lose sight of why the design existed in the first place. And there are also a lot of us that we put ourselves in the position of the player, which robs us of that critical step where we're describing someone that isn't us going through an experience that we're building.
That's a good point, because when I first started in game design, I thought that my job was writing like a moment-to-moment script for what the player was going to experience, right? Which took a lot of agency away from the player, and it took me a lot of years of doing this to realize that it's almost better to start from the emotion that you want the player to experience and work back from that. Has that been your experience as well?
I feel like I followed a similar trajectory. I mean, I don't want to knock going to the detail of writing a moment-to-moment description of what the player goes through. I think there's a lot of value in that. But actually achieving it can be kind of tricky. And so if you were to lay on top of that moment-to-moment thing, the reason why these steps lead to an emotional result, right? When you build that software, you can now test, did we get that emotional result? And now you can change the way you work so that it converges on that emotional result. And I think these sort of like convergent points in our objective structure, because I think this could be applied to a much broader context, is a way to kind of counteract the horrible state we get into when we build lots of things and things start getting a little disorganized and you have too many threads that start going in too many directions and you get that sinking feeling like you've lost control of the complexity and you sort of just start falling back on, well, what's the best part that we have and let's just do that instead. And I don't want to call that a failure state because it happens too often, but that's a side effect of not having that initial kind of like the creative part of our design or our inception of the idea. It was not organized enough. It didn't have enough language clarifying its parts. It was too much just a fuzzy feeling, right? So you need both those pieces together, the emotional target, which is different than the way I feel, and these pieces that'll lead us there.
Let's drill down on that a little, because I think that this is applicable outside of game design, right? Anybody in business has probably had to lead a brainstorm of some kind at one point or another. Maybe it's conceptualizing a new product, maybe it's coming up with a marketing plan, maybe it's planning a conference, but you're going to have to lead a brainstorm, and there's got to be a better way of doing it than just getting a bunch of people in a room with a whiteboard and coffee, right?
So true.
So how do you approach that? Because you've led creative teams and have had to kind of gel them from the beginning.
So I think at the beginning I had problems of maybe being a bit too dictatorial, at least once I got power. And I think when you're young and you have that power, you're inclined to cling to what you believe is true. Because when you believe it's true to you, right? And why wouldn't you want to break that down? But I think the mature perspective I have today on it is really recognizing that for those in the group that are the stakeholders, that you need to achieve being on the same page. And it's not enough to just have the other people go, yeah, I know what you mean. That care and effort needs to be put into us being able to verify that we're seeing the same thing, that we're working towards the same goals. I think that too many projects assume that you are headed in the right direction because everyone gets along, and that it's not, that you aren't taking it as a sort of a scientific effort to understand that if we don't see it the same way, the differences become where the project diverges and where inefficiencies start to mount. And so what is a process, right? A process of communication and relationship that gives us confidence that when I say we're heading in this direction, you hear it the same way I mean it. And that takes much more work than I think anyone would ever realize at first.
So when it comes to leading a team doing that, what does that look like? Does that look like putting some guardrails around the brainstorm to begin with, or maybe defining some concepts up front that are sort of a starting point?
Yeah, well, I think inevitably in any of these situations, right, different people are going to have different responsibilities. Someone is theoretically going to be in charge or sort of practically in charge, right? Groups usually know who they'll look to kind of lead the effort. A little trick that I like to make use of is for the person who has the most authority, that they step away from identifying details or proposing details and spend more of their effort kind of establishing constraints for the others. And then those constraints being in alignment with the other people's roles, for example. So if someone is kind of like an art director, let's say, in the beginning of a project, to kind of start, from a perspective of kind of maybe emotional boundaries at first, or, stylistic ones, or maybe audience affinity boundaries, establish some spaces to work inside and negotiate what that space is with them. Right now, think about what happens to two people that negotiate the space that one of them is going to work in, right? That becomes a way to create an organized set of responsibilities for multiple people to work on a single concept. I've only really been able to do this in practice, ultimately, mostly with close friends, and more recently than a long time ago, because a long time ago, you get that feeling that we're well connected, we understand each other, so we don't have to do things. And then as you get older, you're like, but why don't we try? Because it might be interesting to like practice this. I recommend it highly. Practice caring more about your relationship with the other major stakeholders, to like get into the time you spend with them, understanding where you're headed, and care more about like, what is the one sentence best description for where we're both going? I'm gonna write mine down, you write yours down. And then we show it at the same time and like, wow, it's more different than I expected.
Yeah.
Or what's the 2-page version of that, right? I'm sure if you sat down, and it matters because the people you're doing this with are inevitably people that you know well, so these exercises you might do are ones that are better sort of constructed out of the relationship you already have.
Yeah.
I hope that's making sense, because it's getting sort of out there in terms of what's going on in here.
It's kind of esoteric, but I think for people who have to do this, it is going to make sense. And maybe it occurred to me to talk a little bit about how, for aspiring game designers or game producers, how has game design documentation changed since you started in the industry? Because I know when I started, there were no game engines that you could go out and license. You had to find somebody to fund your game based on a design document, and then you started building an engine to build it, and then you did, and it was a whole big monster deal that way. But it's changed a lot, hasn't it? And if you were advising a new designer now, how would you tell them to focus on how their game design works, what it physically looks like?
Well, first of all, I think that we could probably gather like 100 game designers from the industry and have like a weekend symposium about what game design documentation should be, and we'd come out of it without much clarity.
With 100 different models, yeah.
Well, I think we'd have what I would predict though is that there'd be this big thrust towards recognizing how dynamic the design of the game is. That it's very easy for small developers to keep trying to remember what they were trying to do at the beginning, and that was the design of the game, or that someone had written a document and that it is a Bible to follow. But the reality is, when you wrote that document, that is when you knew the least about this project. Every day you spend, every hour you spend, the more you get to know the other people who are going to be responsible for major parts of the project, you are acquainting yourself with a more true understanding of that future product. And so that obviously wants to be tracked. And it's sort of ridiculous that it doesn't get sort of monitored on a regular basis. But I get it. It takes a ton of work and time. So what are some shortcuts that we can take from a design documentation standpoint? I feel like some teams have reached some success with the ways in which they use wikis. Sort of compartmentalizing documentation into like major systems and having them be separate from sort of like the player description or the emotional arc of a player going through it, so that those two things aren't in lockstep with each other, so that the technical documentation of the design becomes a interpretation of the experiential goals, can be a way to add flexibility to the documentation. But let me take a step back. My stance on documentation for games, whatever is necessary to explain it well to the person that needs to read it. So what you would write for an investor is vastly different than what you would write for your programmer. It's totally different than from what you would write to your co-lead. If you're two people making the game, they need to just understand you. So that could actually be a diagram with a conversation, and a clip of a video from a movie you like. If that's enough, that's fine. Now, more often than not, that's not enough. But it ends up becoming so situational and contextually specific, because so many games are so different from each other, that I would say anyone who proposes a common format for game design documentation can't possibly be right for you, unless you're lucky.
I would say maybe start with wikis, because wikis tend to work for everything.
Yeah, and they can be edited live, which is key.
Yeah, yeah. But, and that's one of the unique challenges of what we do, right? Is it's not just a matter of creating a design and then communicating it to a team. We've got very different personalities and, cognitive types that make up a game design studio or make up a design. You have to be able to communicate to engineers that are very literal and left-brained, and you need, at the same time, you need artists and animators and sound designers that are thinking in very different ways, and the documentation to them almost has to be completely different, right?
It's an easy example, right? If you were to write a specification for a feature for a programmer, to what extent does that help the artist?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and here's a question that I get a lot from companies that I've advised or that I've invested in is, where in the creative process do you take this out and validate it in the market? Because anybody who's working on a game prototype or something that they want to show an investor or show a publisher, they're wondering, what level of polish do I need to get this to? How far along does it have to be for me to get my idea across and show it off? When you're designing for yourself, and maybe you don't have the immediate pressure of investors and things, at what point do you want to take a new game mechanic or a new character or something out and just get validation that the audience you're targeting is going to support that?
I mean, I feel like in today's world, and if you were serious about the business, you would be doing that as soon as possible. To the point where before you've started development, that you've already tried the idea out through talking. You've talked to people that you think mattered about it. You've tried it out on others. You might even have a Discord channel where you've just put the idea out and you're trying to gather people to join that Discord, and you just drive some conversations. Someone who's practiced this kind of the emotional pitch and a promise of an experience without knowing any details, let's say. You literally haven't done the work to understand more about the game, but now you're trying that, just the log line on people out. I think it could be as early as that, right? And there's this fallacy that it needs to be polished before you can show it. It needs to be polished before you go big with it. It needs to be polished before you put a lot of marketing money behind it. But to communicate, to get information out there and ask for feedback, that could happen right now, almost under all circumstances, right? And that there's actually a more complicated system that you need to kind of put into, to be thinking about, to understand when, if we have the idea out, let's say we did our Kickstarter and we have a demo, but the demo doesn't feel very good. Well, certainly some of your friends should be playing it. So that's a certain level of release. If it got sufficiently better, and let's say you had a Discord channel that you felt was pretty private and really you've gotten close to over a long period of time, you might want to share it with them. If it's like a Discord with like 8,000 people that all showed up yesterday, maybe not, right? There's so many conditions on a lot of these questions, that it's you as the audience can't be looking for singular solutions to your problems. One of the steps that might be missing is that you need to be looking inward with more resolution and understanding the ideas you're trying to present to the public, right? And that if you have no idea how people will respond to something, then you have to talk to someone. So now you have an idea how someone will respond to something. Your relationship with your theoretical audience is sort of 50% or more of the game that you're playing. And so get involved with them, go engage with them, find a way to get more information. If you have a question about something you've done and whether it makes sense, have you asked your closest friend about it? Who else can you ask? Have you done that actual reaching out and social work to validate some of those ideas?
Yeah.
So I'm sorry for the long answer, but the short answer is now.
I think another thing that's changed since we started was we used to develop games as products and put them in a box, and the box would go into stores and people would buy it in stores, and that was the end of it, right? So you didn't really have a chance to validate as you went along. Now, though, I think a big part of what designers have to have a command of is what is the business model that is going to drive this game. And even at the point that I'm designing mechanics or I'm designing a story progression, I have to be thinking about how is this going to be monetized? How am I going to keep the studio open? By when I release this product, has that been a challenge for you?
Yeah. Yes. Well, in some ways, it's unfair for the designer to have to understand all the business models that the designs fit in. And I think from a practical standpoint, many designs for games simply follow in the footsteps of other game shapes, so they don't have to worry about it. And then they just follow the model of games that are like them. But I think that there's probably much advantage to be gained by becoming an expert in the platforms and the differences in the audiences for those platforms. Like, why is one platform more successful than another? Why is it that one platform attracts people from different parts of the world? And start getting, like, this is relevant to you as a designer because half of your job as a designer is analyzing your audience, is understanding how you translate your ideas into an experience that they can have and that they can understand the same way you understand it. So, and that's a tall order, right? Like, how do you analyze the audience of people who play Fortnite? And maybe that's too tall an order, right? Maybe instead you can analyze the audience of like your siblings when you try to play tag with them. But there's I think a weird hack for trying to kind of develop these skills of audience analysis is bounce between the KPIs of the things like App Annie and Sensor Tower and or just these like reports about the industry. Jump from those to your mom, to your best friend. You know so many things about the people you know well. You can make guesses about what makes them happy. If you were to design a game for just that one person, you actually have all the demographic data you need right now. And then just recognize that for an audience of, let's say, a small indie title that, let's say, you love, you actually have a lot of that information as well. So if you were going to make a game similar to a game that maybe was fanatically engaging for, let's say, 10,000 people, and you're one of those 10,000 people, you could imagine that you know those 10,000 people well. And what I'm describing here are these sort of like unexpected pathways that you already have in your understanding of audiences, and try to make use of those to build a language for who it is you're trying to build for right now, I guess.
So a jumping off point to that creative process is defining or visualizing the audience and going from that.
Yeah.
I think Tomo and I could go on forever doing this. I think we're going to run out of time, and I want to leave at least a moment for any questions from the audience for Tomo on the subject of game development. And yes, do we have a microphone that we can? Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering how much of the theory of game design are you using in practice in terms of what you've learned and what you've kind of theorized in?
In one way, a lot. It's always
so maybe repeat the question.
Oh yeah, the question was how much of game design theory do I use in my work? Yeah. And so the quick answer is all the time, a lot. But the answer that maybe you don't want to hear is that what is game design theory? Right? I think that there's lots of different perspectives on what is right and wrong in game design. And so if we wanted to distill that though into something maybe that we can't argue against, game design is if I make something for someone and they do what I expect them to do. Or if we want to be statistical about it, if 1,000 people were to engage in it, that a percentage of people would do what I expect them to do of a sufficient threshold. And so whatever I thought or however I manage this process of creating that experience, that's what game design is.
One more question over here.
Hi, Tomo. We are seeing a lot of, say, mass exodus or, say, a systemic correction happening in the gaming industry currently. You see many layoffs happening. So what are your views, given that, at one length, people demand newer things, newer games. And when you prepare a AAA game to plan it and to get it into the market, it would take probably 3 to 4 years, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, $200 to $300 million on average. If it bombs, then how does one come out of it? Because that is one of the reasons why I believe there has been lots of exodus or correction happening. So just wanted a views on that.
Yeah, the question had to do with the sort of general systemic collapse in the game industry that we're encountering. There are a lot of reasons for that. And also part of the question was sort of this idea of like, how do you cope with the, like, sort of the risk, ultimately, of doing projects? Part of the problem right now is if you have something very new, you cannot have a project that'll take a long time. And it's not a good idea, right? I wouldn't recommend trying to do something very new that will take you a lot of time and a ton of money to do. That's a high risk endeavor. What I would do instead if you had access to those resources is figure out a way to start testing for future possibilities. So like I have an interesting idea and I'd like to start feeling it out, like get closer to engaging now with the audience. And so can you make a small prototype? Can you make a small mobile game? Because mobile games get made sometimes in weeks, right? And that's kind of an iterative time frame that might be better for a situation as volatile as today. But as we look at all of the sectors of the industry, all of the ways in which games are done are still functioning. Like there are no dying game types. They're just game types that are very sad because they're not growing anymore.
But I think to that point too, smaller games right now are a viable business model in and of themselves. If you look at the top 10 games on Steam right now by sales, 3 of them were made by either one person or half a dozen person teams. And they're not epic scale 70-hour games. You know, they're smaller experiences or repeatable experiences.
Well, and I can add to that big games are not for innovation. Big games are for turning the volume up on something you know will work. And small games are there to discover new things.
Good point. That's a great note to end on. As the most quotable person in the games industry, I think that's a great thing to end on.
The quotable king,
Thank you.
everybody. Tomo, you're amazing. Thank you, Clark Stacey, our superhero.